Have you ever wondered if there is a limit to how much fire a single ship can endure before the iron itself begins to scream? Most legends are born from a lucky shot or a swift victory, but the story of the USS Laffey is a brutal testament to human grit. To the Japanese pilots in the spring of 1945, she was supposed to be a sacrificial lamb at the fleet's edge, but for those of us who stood on her vibrating decks, she became an island of steel that simply refused to sink into the deep. The fascination with the Laffey is not just about her guns, but the psychological weight of holding a line against 22 enemies. My name is a shadow now, but I remember the morning of April 16th when the horizon of Okinawa became a jagged line of smoke. We were a small piece in a deadly game, but we were about to become the center of a storm that defied naval rules. The fascination with our ship began long before that morning, as the USS Laffey was a Sumner-class destroyer, built to replace a fallen predecessor. We carried the name of a hero lost in the bloody waters of Guadalcanal, and that psychological weight felt like a constant shadow over us. The secret flaw of our position was our role as a radar picket ship, meaning we were the first thing the enemy saw. We were the tripwire of the fleet, stationed miles away from the heavy protection of the battleships, acting essentially as bait for the kamikazes. The fascination of the crew was our collective focus, a sharp sense of duty that kept us drilling at our 20mm mounts. We knew the suicide planes were coming, a psychological terror that turned every beautiful tropical sunrise into a source of deep anxiety. We were alone at Picket Station 1, a gray speck on the water that was about to be challenged by history's most concentrated attack. The psychological weight of the kamikaze threat was unlike anything we had faced in the long years of the war across the shifting Pacific. It was not just about fighting a machine, it was about fighting a human being who had already made peace with his own violent death. The fascination of the divine wind was a dark mystery to us, a fanatical devotion that turned planes into guided missiles with a soul. We watched the radar screens with a silent intensity, seeing the dots multiply until the sky above Okinawa was cluttered with ghosts. The secret flaw of being alone on the picket station was that there was no one to hide behind, no massive hull to absorb fire. We were the solitary target, a pyre of steel waiting for the first impact, and the air was thick with the scent of salt. Every beat of our hearts seemed tuned to the distant hum of the engines coming to take us to the bottom of the abyss. I remember the first sighting, a speck on the horizon that grew with terrifying speed into the shape of an Naval dive bomber. The fascination of the moment was the silence before the roar, that split second where the world holds its breath before the metal screams. The psychological weight hit us when the Naval did not pull out of its dive, but pointed its nose directly at our bridge with focus. Our gunners opened fire, the 5-inch mounts thundering in a rhythmic cadence that shook the very marrow of our bones and the ship's rivets. We watched the plane disintegrate in midair, a ball of fire that fell harmlessly into the sea. But there was no time for relief. Behind that first plane were dozens of others, a swarm of Zeros and Oscars, all converging on our position like wasps to a nest. The secret flaw of our defense was our limited ammunition, a realization that forced us to make every single shell count for our lives. The fascination of the battle was the speed with which the chaos escalated, turning our orderly decks into a landscape of fire and burning fuel. Within 20 minutes, we were being attacked from every point of the compass at once, a 360-degree nightmare that stretched us thin. The psychological weight of the noise was deafening, a wall of sound from anti-aircraft fire, screaming engines, and the dull thuds of near misses. We saw the second kamikaze strike the after 5-inch mount, a massive explosion that killed everyone nearby and sent black smoke into the air. The secret flaw of our ship was now exposed, as fire began to spread toward the magazines, threatening to blow us apart from within. But the gunners on the remaining mounts did not waver. They merely turned their barrels to the next threat with a cold, mechanical grit. We were no longer just a ship. We were a collective will to survive, a living entity of steel and bone fighting for time. As the third and fourth planes struck us, the fascination of our survival became a matter of physics and the incredible strength of the hull. The psychological weight of the casualties was rising, but survivors stepped over the fallen to take their places at the guns without hesitation. We were hit in the stern and the rudder jammed at 26 degrees, forcing the Laffey into a wide, helpless circle in the death zone. The secret flaw of a jammed rudder should have been our death sentence, making us a predictable and easy target for the suicide pilots. Yet that circle became our defense, as our gunners used the rotation to bring different batteries to bear on the swarms of diving planes. We were a spinning fortress of fire, a gray ghost that refused to stop fighting even with our superstructure torn into ribbons of shrapnel. The fascination of the enemy must have been intense, as they saw a small destroyer take blow after blow and still spit fire. The psychological weight of the fire was the most terrifying part, as gasoline from the crashed planes turned the stern into a 1,000-degree hell. I saw men standing in knee-deep water and oil, still passing ammunition to guns that were so hot the paint was bubbling off. The fascination of the Laffey was that she did not just take the hits, but gave them back with a fury that stunned the pilots. We were a wrecked ruin, our mast leaning and our radar smashed, but the 20mm guns still barked at anything that moved above us. The secret flaw of the enemy's tactic was their singular focus on us, which allowed our gunners to predict their flight paths and lead. We were being hammered like an anvil, but the more they hit us, the harder we became, a psychological shift that occurs when nothing remains. Every man on that ship was a hero that day, not because they lacked fear, but because they ignored it to perform the impossible. I remember the sight of a Zero clipping our radar mast and crashing into the sea, its wingtip nearly taking the head off a lookout. The fascination of the battle was this strange, hyper-focused calm that fell over the crew, even as the ship was being dismantled around us. The psychological weight of the smoke was suffocating, making it hard to see targets until they were right on top of us in the haze. The secret flaw of our situation was the overwhelming number of planes. For every one we shot down, 2 more emerged from the horizon. We were hit by a bomb that penetrated the deck and exploded in the after-engine room, killing the brave men below decks. Yet the lights flickered and stayed on, a mechanical miracle that matched the human miracle happening on the blood-stained and blackened decks above. We were the ship that would not die, and the legend was being written in the fire and salt of that terrible morning. The fascination with the final minutes of the attack was the arrival of American Hellcats from the carriers, diving in to help us clear. The psychological weight of seeing those friendly wings was like a shot of adrenaline, but the battle was far from over as Kamikazes ignored them. 1-0 chased a Hellcat so closely that both planes flew through our own anti-aircraft fire, a chaotic dance of death near our bridge. The secret flaw of the enemy's desperation was now evident. They were throwing everything at a single destroyer that refused to grant them victory. We had been hit by 6 suicide planes and 4 bombs, but Captain Becton famously said he would never abandon ship while a gun fired. That statement became the psychological anchor for the entire crew, a promise that we would return home together or sink fighting to the man. We were the Laffey, and we were making the Empire pay for every inch of steel they tried to take from us in that hell. As the last of the 22 attackers was splashed or driven off, a strange and heavy silence finally fell over the blackened USS Laffey. The fascination of the aftermath was the sight of the ship. She was a twisted, smoking ruin that looked more like a junkyard than a vessel. The psychological weight of the 80-minute battle was etched on the faces of the survivors, who stood among the wreckage in a state of shock. The secret flaw of the Japanese plan was revealed. They used massive force to destroy a ship, but that ship was still defiant. We were towed back to port, a journey that felt like a victory parade for a ghost that had returned from the gates of death. The story of the Laffey is the story of what happens when a crew decides that surrender is not an option, regardless of the fire. We were the ship that would not die, and our scars became the proudest medals of honor we would ever carry in our lives. The fascination with the first hour of the carnage was the relentless repetition of death, as wave after wave of suicide planes emerged from the morning mist. The psychological weight of the endless enigma was the feeling that we were fighting a force that had abandoned all reason for the sake of destruction. We saw the Zeros and Vals circling like vultures, their pilots waiting for a gap in our defensive fire to plunge into our smoking and heavy hull. The secret flaw of the attack was the sheer intensity, as the volume of fire from our 20mm guns became a physical wall of lead. We felt the ship vibrate with the fury of 1,000 drums, a mechanical scream that echoed the silent prayers of the men on the line. The air was a thick soup of cordite and saltwater spray, a sensory assault that made every second feel like a lifetime of struggle. We were no longer sailors of a modern age, but warriors of a primal fire, standing our ground in a sea of absolute chaos. I remember the secret flaw of the third Kamikaze, a Nakajima Oscar that banked sharply and struck the deckhouse with a force that shook the entire frame. The fascination of the impact was the way the explosion felt like a localized sun, a blinding flash of orange that consumed the air around us. The psychological weight of the fire in the guts was the realization that our ammunition was being cooked by the heat of the burning gasoline. We saw the damage control parties moving into the Inferno with a calm that defied the surrounding madness of the screams and the smoke. The fascination of their bravery was a light in the dark, as they used their bare hands to pull twisted metal away from the wounded. We felt the ship groan as the water from the hoses filled the compartments, a necessary weight that threatened to sink us from our own mercy. Every man knew that if the fire reached the main magazines, the legend of the Laffey would end in a final and blinding flash. The psychological weight of the broken rudder was a new kind of terror, as the ship began its permanent and helpless circle under the eyes of the enemy. The fascination of the geometry was how the Laffey carved its path through the water, a gray ghost tracing a ritual of defiance on the Pacific. The secret flaw of being trapped in a circle was the predictability, but our captain turned that vulnerability into a lethal and shifting and rotating shield. We saw the Japanese pilots trying to time their dives to catch us on the turn, but our gunners anticipated every move with a precision. The fascination of the duel was the way the ship seemed to lean into the curve, its guns firing over the rails with a rhythmic. We felt the centrifugal force pulling at our bodies, a physical reminder that we were caught in a vortex of steel and salt and blood. The air was a whirlwind of shrapnel that hissed as it hit the water, a deadly rain that never seemed to stop for a breath. I often think about the secret flaw of the fifth attacker, which struck the bridge with a glancing blow that showered the officers in glass and metal. The fascination of the near miss was the sight of Captain Becton standing unmoved as the debris of the enemy plane rained down around his feet. The psychological weight of his iron presence was the glue that held the fractured spirit of the crew together in the middle of the fire. We saw the blood on his face, but his voice remained steady over the comms, a command that felt like a solid rock in a sea. The fascination of the leadership was the way he ignored his own safety to ensure that every gun had a target and every fire. We felt the ship recoil under another hit, but the steady gaze of the bridge crew told us that the fighting lady was still. The secret flaw of the enemy was that they could break our iron, but they could never reach the heart of the man in command. The air on the bridge was a mixture of sweat and iron, a workspace of heroes who were writing history with every word. The fascination with the sixth Kamikaze was the secret flaw of the forward deck, where the impact of a bomb turned the area into a landscape. The psychological weight of the frontal assault was the loss of our primary forward vision, as smoke and debris filled the eyes of the lookouts. We saw the gunners of Mount 51 continuing to fire into the haze, their shells cutting through the black clouds to find the hidden enemies. The fascination of the accuracy was a miracle of instinct, as men fired at sounds and shadows when the world was hidden by the soot. We felt the psychological weight of the isolation as the wires to the forward guns were severed, leaving the crews to fight their own. The secret flaw of the communication was overcome by the shouts of the men, a human chain of sound that bypassed the broken electronics. The ship was a mangled mess of wires and pipes, a mechanical corpse that was still breathing through the lungs of its entire crew. Every shell that left the breach was a proof of life, a defiant bark that told the Japanese we were still on watch. I remember the secret flaw of the seventh strike, a valve that clipped the radar mast and sent the rotating antenna crashing into the sea. The fascination of the loss of sight was the way it forced us to rely on our primitive senses to survive the coming in heavy. The psychological weight of being blinded in a swarm of 22 planes was a terror that made the hair on our necks stand up. We saw the lookouts tying themselves to the rails, their eyes scanning the blue for the flash of a wing or the glint of a. The fascination of the human radar was the speed of the warnings, as a dozen voices shouted directions to the gunners on the deck. We felt the psychological weight of the proximity. As the enemy planes flew so low, we could see the goggles on the pilots' faces. The secret flaw of the height was their mistake, as it brought them into the range of our most lethal and accurate and fast. The air was a chaotic mess of tracers and smoke, a visual and sensory overload that tested the sanity of every man on board. We were a blind giant swinging a club in the dark, but every strike we landed felt like a victory for the living. The fascination with the 8th and 9th hits was the secret flaw of the midships, where the explosions tore into the very heart of the engine. The psychological weight of the loss of power was a sudden and cold dread as the lights flickered and the engines began to groan, and we saw the black gang working in the steam and the heat, their skin blistering as they fought to keep the pressure in the ancient, and the fascination of the mechanical struggle was the way the ship refused to stop moving, a momentum born of desperation and the spirit of the... We felt the ship settle deeper into the water, a heavy and dark and cold and silent movement that signaled the intake of the sea. The secret flaw of our buoyancy was the number of holes in the hull, but the pumps were still screaming their own and defiant. The air below decks was a labyrinth of steam and shadows, a hellish workspace where the true ship that would not die was being. We were fighting the ocean as much as the Japanese, a two-front war where the only prize was the right to see the next. Every turn of the screw was a miracle of engineering, a heartbeat of iron that refused to stop in the middle of the fire. I often think about the secret flaw of the 10th attacker, which was shot down by a 20mm gunner, who was already wounded in the leg. The fascination of the single gunner was the sight of a young boy refusing to leave his post, even as the blood pooled at. The psychological weight of the last bullet was the feeling that every round we fired was the most precious thing in the entire and wide. We saw the Zero explode just yards from the rail, a shower of aluminum and fuel that washed over the gunner in a hotend. The fascination of the Endurance was the way he wiped the oil from his eyes and reached for the next magazine without a word of. We felt the psychological weight of his courage, a silent burden that forced everyone else to work twice as hard to match his and heavy. The secret flaw of the enemy was their failure to understand that a wounded American sailor is a more dangerous enemy than a healthy. The air was filled with the smell of scorched flesh and salt, a scent of war that stayed in our lungs for the rest. We were a crew of fragments, but those fragments were being forged into a single and unbreakable and heavy and dark and final and absolute. The fascination with the 11th and 12th strikes was the secret flaw of the coordinated attack, as two planes dove from different angles simultaneously. The psychological weight of the crossfire was a moment where we had to decide which death to face first in the middle of the dark. We saw the forward guns take the first plane, while the aft 40mm mount engaged the second with a fury that was born of pure. The fascination of the destruction was the way both planes vanished in a cloud of fire, their wreckage crossing over the deck in a... We felt the psychological weight of the near miss, as the debris of the second plane cut the lifelines and smashed the remaining lifeboats. The secret flaw of the plan was the timing, as their simultaneous arrival allowed our gunners to use the same wall of lead for. The air was a solid mass of steel and flame, a density of combat that made it impossible to hear the sound of our own. We were a ship of miracles, a vessel that was being protected by a shield of courage and the stubbornness of the iron, and every explosion that didn't sink us was a step closer to the legend, a story of the Laffey that would never be forgotten. As the second part of our story reaches its end, the fascination with the USS Laffey remains a study in the soul of the and heavy. The psychological weight of her history is the beauty of her legend, a story of how a single destroyer stood against an empire, and the secret flaw of her survival was the heart of the men who refused to let the fire win in the middle of the sea. We saw the sky turning a dark and oily gray, a signal that the first hour of the hell was finally coming to a close. The fascination of the grit was the way the ship still looked like a ship, despite the 10 hits and the fires and We felt the psychological weight of the coming hours, a realization that the 22 attackers were only halfway through their suicidal and heavy. The air was silent for a fleeting second, a pause in the thunder that allowed us to hear the sound of the ocean against the... We were the guardians of the Laffey, and our watch was a memory of the smoke and the fire and the absolute and final. The legend of the ship that would not die was only beginning to burn, a flame of defiance that would light the way to. The fascination with the middle of the 80-minute storm was the psychological weight of the second wind, a moment where the crew moved beyond terror into a cold, mechanical state of survival. The secret flaw of the Japanese assault was the assumption that a ship this broken would eventually lose its will to resist the encroaching darkness. We saw the 13th and 14th planes, a pair of Mitsubishi Zeros, banking in a lethal synchronicity that aimed for the very center of our blackened and smoking bridge. The fascination of the intercept was our forward gunners firing through their own smoke, their shells finding the lead plane and turning it into a spectacular and violent cloud of debris. We felt the ship shudder as the wreckage of the second plane skimmed across the deck, its wing shearing off a lifer raft before tumbling into the cold and indifferent Pacific. The psychological weight of the continuous strike was a mental erosion, yet our hands moved with a precision that seemed to bypass the exhaustion of the flesh. The air was a thick, suffocating blanket of ash and gasoline, a sensory cage that trapped us in a world where only the next trigger pull mattered. I remember the secret flaw of the after-gun tub, where the fascination was the sight of men standing ankle-deep in blood and water while still passing heavy canisters of ammunition. The psychological weight of the silent mounts was a hollow ache, as we realized that half our firepower had been silenced by the relentless and heavy and dark impacts. We saw the 15th attacker, a Naval, diving with a screeching engine that sounded like a scream from the depths of a prehistoric and violent abyss. The fascination of the kill was a 20mm gunner who hit the pilot directly, causing the plane to veer sharply and miss our hull by a mere and terrifying 5 feet. We felt the psychological weight of the geyser, as the resulting explosion underwater lifted the Laffey's stern completely out of the sea for a sickening and breathless second. The secret flaw of the hull was its flexibility, as the steel groaned but did not snap under the immense and crushing pressure of the near miss. The air was filled with the hiss of steam as the water hit the red-hot metal of the guns, a sound of a ship that was breathing its own and defiant fire. The psychological weight of the 16th hit was a bomb that struck the base of the mast, sending a shower of sparks and jagged steel through the open bridge. The fascination of the carnage was the sight of the navigation charts being set on fire, as if the world we knew was being erased by the heat of the war. We saw the helmsman wrestling with the wheel, his knuckles white as he fought to maintain the circle that was our only and fragile and desperate shield. The fascination of the Endurance was the way the officers stayed at their posts, their uniforms shredded and their faces blackened by the soot of 1,000 explosions. We felt the psychological weight of the isolation as the internal comms failed, leaving us to communicate through a series of hand signals and desperate vocalized shouts. The secret flaw of the technology was replaced by the strength of the spirit, a human connection that proved to be more durable than any wire or vacuum tube. The air on the bridge was a mix of scorched ozone and the sharp tang of sweat, a workspace of ghosts who were still commanding a living and breathing giant. I often think about the secret flaw of the medical ward, where the fascination was the calm focus of the doctors working in a dark room filled with smoke and pain. The psychological weight of the shadow triage was a burden for the corpsmen, who had to decide who could be saved, while the ship was literally falling apart around them. We saw the wounded lying on the mess tables, their eyes reflecting the dim glow of the battle lanterns as the hull plates vibrated from the hits. The fascination of the Resilience was a sailor who, despite losing an arm, pointed toward the deck and told his brothers to get back to the guns. We felt the psychological weight of his sacrifice, a silent and heavy energy that rippled through the ship and reached every man still standing on the line. The secret flaw of the death was its inability to break the chain of command or the bond of the crew, a miracle of the human heart in the fire. The air in the ward was thick and heavy, a humid environment where life and death were separated by the steady hand of a tired and bloody surgeon. The fascination with the 17th attacker was a Judy bomber that came in low and fast, skipping over the waves like a flat stone aimed at our vulnerable and heavy waterline. The psychological weight of the torpedo profile was a sudden, sharp fear that the ship's belly would be opened to the cold and hungry appetite of the deep. We saw our midship gunners depress their barrels to the absolute limit, firing into the water to create a wall of splashes that obscured the pilot's vision. The fascination of the defense was the plane catching a wing on a wave and cartwheeling into a massive explosion of spray and fuel and jagged and burning metal. We felt the psychological weight of the close call as the shockwave rattled the teeth in our heads and sent a fresh wave of oil across the blackened deck. The secret flaw of the low-level attack was the pilot's overconfidence, a mistake that brought him into the range of our most desperate and focused and lethal fire. The air was a whirlwind of salt and smoke, a visual blur where the blue of the sea and the black of the soot merged into a single and dark horizon. I remember the secret flaw of the ammunition hoists, where the fascination was the human chain that formed when the mechanical lifts finally failed under the strain of the heat. The psychological weight of hand-passing 50-pound shells through the narrow, smoky scuttles was a test of muscle and bone that lasted for nearly an hour. We saw the skin on the men's hands peeling away from the friction of the metal, yet no one stopped the flow of steel to the guns. The fascination of the rhythm was a mechanical-human hybrid, a pulse of defense that kept the 40mm mounts barking at the heavy and dark sky. We felt the psychological weight of the countdown, knowing that we were down to our final crates of ammunition as the 18th and 19th planes emerged. The secret flaw of our supply was compensated by the accuracy of the gunners, who made every single round a killing blow for the Empire. The air in the lower decks was a stifling and hot furnace, a place where the true ship that would not die was being fueled by the sweat of the brave. The fascination with the 20th attacker was the secret flaw of the sun, as the pilot used the glare to hide his final and suicidal dive toward our forward guns. The psychological weight of the blinding light was a moment of vulnerability where we couldn't see the death until it was already screaming through the rigging and the wires. We saw the silhouette of the Zero appearing as a black cross in the center of the sun, a vision of the end that felt both beautiful and terrifying. The fascination of the reaction was a gunner who fired by instinct, tracking the sound of the engine when his eyes were blinded by the golden and heavy and dark light. We felt the ship lurch as the plane clipped the forward mount, a glancing blow that sent a shower of sparks across the faces of the crew. The secret flaw of the sun was defeated by the memory of the gun, a muscle memory that allowed us to kill the threat we couldn't even clearly see. The air was momentarily bright, a flash of celestial fire that was quickly replaced by the familiar and dark and oily and heavy smoke of the burning and broken ship. I often think about the secret flaw of the 21st Kamikaze, which was a Judy that had been chasing us for 10 minutes through the smoke and the near misses of the deep. The fascination of the long hunt was the pilot's patience, a cold and calculated approach that stood in stark contrast to the frantic and suicidal rushes of the others. The psychological weight of being watched by a predator was a chilling sensation, a feeling that our time had finally run out in the middle of the Pacific. We saw the plane banking for its final run, its engine tuned to a high-pitched scream that echoed the fatigue of our own, and heavy and tired and iron bones. The fascination of the kill was a joint effort between our guns and a Marine Corsair that dove from the clouds to rake the Judy's wings. We felt the psychological weight of the explosion as the plane vanished in a ball of fire, the debris raining down like a funeral shroud over the stern. The secret flaw of the Hunter was the arrival of the Guardians, a reminder that even in our isolation, we were never truly and completely and absolute alone. The fascination with the last attack was the 22nd plane, a Zero that seemed to represent the final and desperate gasp of the Imperial Japanese navies in heavy and dark and cold fury. The psychological weight of the final boss was a feeling of exhaustion so deep it felt like our spirits were being pulled into the water by the weight of the iron. We saw the plane coming in straight and level, a simple and honest and deadly approach that challenged our remaining gunners to one last and final duel of the sun. The fascination of the end was the sight of every operational gun on the Laffey firing simultaneously, a wall of lead that literally shredded the Zero before it could reach the rail. We felt the psychological weight of the silence that followed, a ringing in our ears that was more deafening than the 100 explosions that had preceded the and heavy and dark and absolute peace. The secret flaw of the attack was its conclusion, as the sky finally emptied and the blue of the Pacific returned to the horizon of our broken and heavy ship. The air was still, a moment of transition where the fighting lady realized she was still afloat and still alive, and still the queen of the heavy and dark and cold picket. As the third part of our story reaches its end, the fascination with the USS Laffey remains a study in the soul of the heavy and dark and absolute and final spirit of the Navy. The psychological weight of her history is the beauty of her legend, a story of how a single destroyer stood against an empire and became the immortal heartbeat of the heavy and dark. The secret flaw of her survival was the heart of the men who refused to let the fire win. A miracle of the heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep. We saw the tugs arriving on the scene, their crews staring at us with the disbelief that was the highest honor a sailor could ever receive from his heavy and dark and cold brothers. The fascination of the grit was the way the ship still held its head high, despite being a twisted and smoking and broken and heavy and dark and oily and bloody ruin of the war. We felt the psychological weight of the future, a realization that we were now the ship that would not die, a name that would live forever in the salt. We were the guardians of the Laffey, and our watch was a memory of the smoke and the fire and the absolute and final and glorious success of the iron. The fascination with the aftermath of the swarm was the psychological weight of the deathly silence, a quiet so profound it felt like the ocean itself was holding its breath. The secret flaw of our survival was the sensory disorientation that followed 80 minutes of constant bone-shaking thunder and the scream of diving engines. We saw the men of the Laffey standing like statues among the ruins of their guns, their eyes vacant as they looked at the blackened and twisted landscape of their home. The fascination of the trauma was the way the adrenaline slowly ebbed away, replaced by a crushing exhaustion that made every limb feel like it was made of solid lead. We felt the ship's slight rhythmic roll in the swells, a gentle movement that mocked the violent and absolute and fiery struggle we had just endured to remain afloat. The secret flaw of the piece was the sight of the blood-stained decks being washed by the sea through the holes in our hull, a cleansing that was both necessary and deeply haunting. The air was finally clearing of the thick, oily soot, revealing a blue sky that seemed far too peaceful for the graveyard of aluminum and steel that surrounded our position. I remember the secret flaw of the first damage report, where the fascination was the miracle of the engine still humming, despite the catastrophic destruction above. The psychological weight of the engine room spirit was the realization that our black gang had fought their own war in a steam-filled and pitch-black hell to keep our power alive. We saw the engineers emerging from the hatches, their faces unrecognizable behind masks of grease and sweat, looking like specters rising from the very bowels of the earth. The fascination of the resilience was the sight of the Laffey's hull. She had taken 6 kamikazes and 4 bombs, yet she refused to let the Pacific claim her heart. We felt the psychological weight of the floating ruin as we inspected the jagged edges of the aft superstructure, which had been reduced to a skeletal and heavy and dark frame of iron. The secret flaw of the enemy's fury was their failure to find our magazines, a series of near misses that felt like the hand of fate had intervened to save the ship that would not die. The air was filled with the sound of the pumps, a steady and desperate heartbeat that was the only thing standing between us and the deep, cold hunger of the abyss. The psychological weight of the body count was the fascination with the heavy and dark and cold reality of our loss as we began to gather the fallen from the smoking ruins. The secret flaw of our victory was the empty spaces in the mess hall, and the silent bunks that would never again hold the brothers who had fought beside us. We saw the rows of stretchers on the forward deck, a somber and final and absolute and heavy line that represented the 32 souls who had paid the ultimate price for our survival. The fascination of the morning was the way the crew worked in silence, a collective and heavy and dark and cold respect that needed no words to express the depth of our shared and bitter grief. We felt the psychological weight of the survivor's guilt, a haunting question of why we were standing in the light while so many better men had vanished into the fire and the dark. The secret flaw of the war was its indifference to heroism, taking the young and the brave with the same cold hand it took the iron and the salt. The air was heavy with the scent of lilies and oil, a funeral atmosphere that hung over the Laffey as we began our long and slow retreat from the station. I often think about the secret flaw of the tow to the anchorage, where the fascination was the sight of the entire fleet stopping their work to witness the return of the ghost. The psychological weight of the Admiral's salute was an electric moment of pride, as signals were flashed from the massive battleships, welcoming the little destroyer back from the gates of death. We saw sailors on the decks of the nearby carriers cheering until their voices broke, a sound that finally pierced the shell of our numb and heavy and dark and cold and silent shock. The fascination of the reception was the disbelief in their eyes. They saw a ship that should have been a memory. Yet here we were, trailing smoke and oil, but still riding the waves with a defiant and heavy and dark head. We felt the psychological weight of the Laffey legend beginning to take root in the fleet. A story that would be whispered in every galley and every engine room from Okinawa to the home shore. The secret flaw of our appearance was the twisted metal that looked like a jagged crown, a physical manifestation of the 80 minutes of hell we had endured for the sake of the and heavy and dark. The fascination with the first night at anchor was the secret flaw of our sleep. As the mind refused to believe the guns were silent and the kamikazes were no longer diving from the moon, the psychological weight of the phantom alarms saw men jumping from their bunks at the sound of a closing door or the distant thud of a crane at work in the dark. We saw the Laffey illuminated by the floodlights of the repair ships, her wounds exposed in a stark and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody light. The fascination of the repairs was the way the ship's skin was patched with scraps of steel and wood, a temporary and desperate and beautiful and tragic effort to make her seaworthy for the journey home. We felt the psychological weight of the broken home, a feeling that the ship was now a part of us and we were a part of her, a bond forged in the fire that could never be broken by time or distance. The secret flaw of the piece was the realization that we were changed forever, our spirits tempered by a heat that the world of the living would never truly and completely and absolute understand. The air was cool and still, but the scent of the fire remained in our hair and our skin, a permanent reminder of the day the and heavy and dark and cold and absolute and final. I remember the secret flaw of the journey to Saipan, where the fascination was the sight of the Laffey, struggling to maintain her speed against the heavy and dark and cold and silent swells of the open sea. The psychological weight of the structural fatigue was a constant worry. As the hull groaned with every wave that hit our patched and battered and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy frames, we saw the divers working on the hull in the tropical waters, their hands moving over the countless holes like healers tending to the wounds of a dying, and heavy, and dark, and cold, and silent, and heavy, and deep, and oily, and bloody, and terrifying, and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy giant. The fascination of the resilience was the way the pumps never stopped their rhythmic and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy song of survival. We felt the psychological weight of the long road home, a journey of thousands of miles that felt like an eternity for a crew that was already exhausted by the and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy fire. The fascination with the secret flaw of the ship's mail call was the psychological weight of receiving letters from families who didn't yet know that their sons had become the ship that would not die. The secret flaw of the timeline was the delay in the news, creating a painful and beautiful and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying. We saw the men reading their letters by the light of the battle lanterns, their faces softening for a moment before the and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying. We felt the psychological weight of the ordinary life we had left behind. A world of green grass and quiet streets that felt like a dream from another life in the middle of the and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying. I often think about the secret flaw of the Laffey's appearance as she entered Pearl Harbor, where the fascination was the silent and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying. The psychological weight of the hero ship was a burden that we carried with a mixture of pride and a deep and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying. We saw the crowds on the pier, their hands waving in a blur of color that looked like the very and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying. The fascination of the return was the realization that the fighting lady was now a part of the and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying. The fascination with the secret flaw of the ship's official presidential unit citation was the psychological weight of the words that described our extraordinary heroism in the middle of the and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying. The secret flaw of the medal was that it could never replace the brothers we lost, but it was a testament to the and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying. We saw the medals being pinned to the chests of the survivors. A silver and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying. We felt the psychological weight of the honor, a feeling that our struggle had been seen and heard, and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying. As the fourth part of our story reaches its end, the fascination with the USS Laffey remains a study in the soul of a ship that refused to die in the middle of the and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying. The psychological weight of her history is the beauty of her legend, a story of how a single destroyer stood against an empire and became the and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying. The secret flaw of her survival was the heart of the men who refused to let the fire win in the middle of the and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying. The fascination with the post-war era was the psychological weight of the cold iron, as the Laffey transitioned from a screaming engine of war to a silent sentinel in the mothball fleet. The secret flaw of the piece was the sudden stillness, a quiet that felt unnatural to a crew whose ears were permanently tuned to the thunder of 5-inch guns. We saw the ship preserved in the brackish waters of the reserve fleet, her jagged scars hidden under layers of protective grease and gray preservative paint. The fascination of the Endurance was her reactivation for the Korean War, proving that the ship that would not die still had a heart of fire ready to serve. We felt the psychological weight of the return to combat, a realization that the ghost of Okinawa was now a veteran mentor for a new generation of sailors. The air around the ship seemed to carry a silent authority, a presence that commanded respect from every modern vessel that crossed her historic wake. We were the guardians of a living relic, a machine that had bypassed the scrapyard to find a second life in the service of freedom. I remember the secret flaw of the long deployments in the 50s, where the fascination was the ship's ability to adapt to a world of jet engines and electronic warfare. The psychological weight of the modernization was a blend of old steel and new technology, a physical manifestation of a navy that was moving faster than the men who built it. We saw the Laffey patrolling the Mediterranean and the Atlantic, her silhouette a familiar and reassuring sight to the Allies who knew her legendary name. The fascination of the routine was the way the old hull handled the heavy seas, a rhythmic and steady and proud motion that felt like the ship was finally at peace with her past. We felt the psychological weight of the Cold War tension, a silent struggle where the fighting lady stood watch over a world that was perpetually on the brink. The secret flaw of the era was the lack of a visible enemy, a psychological drain that tested the patience and the discipline of the men on the line. The air was filled with the hum of the new radar sets, an electronic pulse that replaced the frantic shouts of the picket station lookouts. The psychological weight of the final decommissioning in 1975 was the fascination with the closing of a chapter that had lasted for over 30 glorious years. The secret flaw of the ceremony was the collective heartbreak of the veterans who gathered to watch the colors being lowered for the very last time. We saw the Laffey sitting silent at the pier, her engines cold and her guns pointed toward a horizon she would never again chase. The fascination of the legacy was the immediate effort to save her from the breakers, a movement fueled by the same grit that had saved her at Okinawa. We felt the psychological weight of the uncertainty as the ship's fate hung in the balance of budgets and political will and public interest. The secret flaw of the iron was its age, but the secret of the soul was the thousands of men who refused to let their home be turned into scrap. The air during those final months was heavy with the scent of nostalgia and oil, a funeral atmosphere that eventually turned into a celebration of survival. We were witnesses to the end of a warrior's active life, but the birth of a permanent and silent and heavy monument. I often think about the secret flaw of the journey to Patriot's Point, the fascination of seeing the Laffey being towed to her final berth in the waters of South Carolina. The psychological weight of the museum status was a transition from a weapon of war to a teacher of history, a vessel of memory for the future. We saw the ship being opened to the public, her decks once again filled with the sound of footsteps and the curious voices of children. The fascination of the preservation was the way the damage from 1945 was highlighted, a physical map of the 80 minutes of hell we endured. We felt the psychological weight of the living history, a realization that as long as people walked these decks, our brothers would never be truly forgotten. The secret flaw of the museum was the constant battle against the salt and the rust, a relentless enemy that required a new kind of vigilance. The air in Charleston was warm and humid, a gentle environment for a ship that had earned the right to rest in the sun. Every rivet we painted was a salute to the past, a commitment to keeping the ship that would not die alive for the world. The fascination with the secret flaw of the underwater hull repairs in 2009 was the psychological weight of seeing the ship almost lost to time. The secret flaw of the environment was the corrosive power of the river, which had eaten through the steel and threatened to sink the legend at her pier. We saw the community rally once again, raising millions of dollars to tow the Laffey to a dry dock for a total and absolute restoration. The fascination of the work was the sight of the hull out of the water, a rare and heavy and dark and cold and silent view of the giant's belly. We felt the psychological weight of the responsibility to the next generation, a feeling that we couldn't let the fighting lady fail on our watch. The secret flaw of the neglect was corrected by the passion of the volunteers and the skill of the modern shipwrights who loved her. The air in the dry dock was filled with the sound of sandblasting and the smell of fresh epoxy, a mechanical rebirth for a spirit that refused to fade. We were the custodians of a miracle, ensuring that the iron remained as strong as the will of the men of Okinawa. I remember the secret flaw of the grand reopening, where the fascination was the sight of the 90-year-old veterans walking the decks they had defended in 1945. The psychological weight of the final reunion was a moment of intense, tearful joy, as brothers in arms found their names engraved on the memorial plaques of the ship. We saw the hands of the elderly sailors touching the gun mounts, their fingers tracing the metal with a familiarity that bypassed the decades of the peace. The fascination of the moment was the silence that fell over the crowd as the stories of the 22 Kamikazes were told once again. We felt the psychological weight of the passing of the torch, a realization that the story was now moving from the living memory to the written history. The secret flaw of time was that it took our bodies, but it could never take the honor we had earned in the smoke. The air was filled with the sound of a lone bugler playing taps, a melody that echoed through the rigging and into the hearts of the free. We were the last of the Sumner-class warriors, a brotherhood of the iron and the fire and the absolute and final truth. The fascination with the secret flaw of the ship's ghostly reputation is the psychological weight of the stories told by the night watchman at the museum today. The secret flaw of the silence is that it isn't truly silent. The ship seems to hold the echoes of the shouts and the thunder of the Great War. We saw the reports of mysterious lights and the sound of phantom boots on the steel ladders, a legend of the gray ghost that refuses to be silenced. The fascination of the paranormal is the idea that the crew and the ship are so tightly bound that even death cannot separate them from the deck. We felt the psychological weight of the eternal watch, a feeling that the Laffey is still standing picket against the darkness of the unknown and the deep. The secret flaw of the logic is that it doesn't matter if it's true. The ship feels alive to everyone who steps aboard her hallowed and heavy and dark frame. The air in the engine rooms is still thick with the presence of the past, a heavy and dark and cold and silent energy that defies the modern world. We are haunted by the glory of our own lives, a story that continues to sail through the dreams of those who remember the fire. I often think about the secret flaw of the Laffey's inclusion in the film and literature of the war. The fascination with how her 80 minutes of hell became a standard for naval heroism. The psychological weight of the pop culture status is a double-edged sword, a way to keep the story alive while risking the loss of the raw, bloody reality of the fire. We saw the actors portraying the crew, their faces clean and their uniforms pressed, a stark contrast to the scorched and oily reality of the fighting lady. The fascination of the dramatization was the way it allowed the world to see the secret of the suicide stand from the safety of their own and quiet homes. We felt the psychological weight of the truth versus myth, a commitment to ensuring that the names of the 32 fallen were never obscured by the glitter of the screen. The secret flaw of the fame was the distance it created, but the secret of the impact was the way it inspired a new and curious generation to seek the truth. The air of the museum is a bridge between the real and the real, a place where the iron speaks for itself in a language of scars. We are the architects of the legend, a crew that turned a disaster into a monument of the American spirit. The fascination with the secret flaw of the ship's physical endurance is that it remains a study in the absolute limits of what a destroyer can withstand in the middle of the sea. The psychological weight of her history is a physical fact that remains unchanged by the passing of the years, or the changing of the heavy and dark tides. We see the Laffey sitting in the harbor of Charleston, her silhouette a reminder that the small and the brave can sometimes overcome the massive and the lethal and the sharp. The fascination of the ship that would not die is her permanence, a story that grows stronger with every passing year of the peace and the light. We felt the psychological weight of the continuity, a realization that we were just one link in a chain of fire and iron that connects the past to the future of the Navy. The secret flaw of the iron was its mortality, but the secret of the soul was the defiance of the men who stood their ground when the sky was falling. The air around the ship is sacred, an atmosphere of honor that will never be erased by the torch or the time or the wind. We are the guardians of the Laffey, and our watch is a memory that will shine as long as the sea is blue. As the fifth part of our story reaches its end, the fascination with the USS Laffey remains a study in the transition from a warrior of the fire to a sentinel of the peace. The psychological weight of her history is the beauty of her legend, a story of how a single destroyer stood against an empire and became the immortal heartbeat of the Navy. The secret flaw of her survival was the heart of the men who refused to let the fire win, a miracle of the heavy and dark and cold and absolute spirit. We saw the sun setting over the harbor, a golden light that reflected off the gray steel of the ship that would not die, and the heavy and dark and silent waves. The fascination of the grit was the way the ship still held its head high, a monument to the 80 minutes of hell that had defined its very and heavy existence. We felt the psychological weight of the final chapter, a realization that the story of the Laffey is a story that will never truly and completely and absolute end in the dark. We were the crew of the Fighting Lady, and our watch is a flame that will burn forever in the hearts of the free and the proud. The fascination with the legacy of the USS Laffey is the psychological weight of the eternal return, as her story transcends the iron of the ship to become a permanent part of the American naval soul. The secret flaw of history is that it often forgets the small vessels, but the world can never ignore the destroyer that stood alone against 22 suicide attackers in the dark. We saw the ship's name etched into the stone of national monuments, a physical anchor for a memory that would otherwise be lost to the salt and the shifting tides. The fascination of the immortality was the way the ship became a classroom for future sailors, teaching them that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to stay at the gun. We felt the psychological weight of the transition from a living crew to a historical narrative, a realization that we were now the ghosts within the pages of the great and bloody books. The air at the museum is a quiet sanctuary, a place where the noise of the 80-minute hell has been replaced by the respectful whispers of the thousands who come to honor the light. Every day she remains afloat is a victory for the spirit, a rhythmic and steady and proud defiance against the silence of the deep and the passage of the years. I remember the secret flaw of the final watch, where the fascination was the sight of the old colors being replaced by new ones, a constant cycle of renewal for the ship that would not die. The psychological weight of the living memorial is a responsibility that rests on the shoulders of the volunteers who keep the rust from the steel and the dust from the memory. We saw the sun reflecting off the restored 20mm mounts, the metal clean and ready as if the enshrouding mists of 1945 could return at any sudden and violent and absolute moment. The fascination of the preservation was the way the ship's wounds were kept visible, a silent testimony to the 6 planes and 4 bombs that tried to claim her heart. We felt the psychological weight of the survivor's duty, a feeling that our lives were a gift from the ship that had absorbed the punishment intended for our own and fragile bodies. The secret flaw of the piece was the longing for the brothers who stayed behind, a haunting and heavy and dark and cold and silent energy that still drifts through the empty and quiet passageways. The air of the harbor is filled with the scent of the sea, a familiar and heavy and constant reminder of the day the world turned to fire and the iron refused to melt. The psychological weight of the Laffey's last stand in the minds of the Japanese veterans was a fascination with a foe that had redefined their very understanding of the word immortal. The secret flaw of the kamikaze strategy was the assumption that a small ship would break under the pressure of a coordinated and suicidal and heavy and dark and absolute strike. We saw the records of the enemy pilots, their shock at seeing the destroyer still firing its guns even as the fires consumed the entire and heavy and dark aft superstructure. The fascination of the respect was mutual. 2 cultures of the sea locked in a dance of death that left only the ghost of the Laffey standing in the middle of the smoke. We felt the psychological weight of the reconciliation as the descendants of both sides met on the deck to offer prayers for the peace and the light and the end of the fire. The secret flaw of the enmity was washed away by the tide, replaced by a deep and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy respect for the warriors of the deep. The air during the ceremonies was still, a moment of absolute and final and heavy closure for a war that had demanded everything from the men of the sun and the stars. I often think about the secret flaw of the ship's internal geometry, the fascination with the narrow corridors that once echoed with the frantic shouts of the ammunition handlers and the heavy and dark and cold breath of the engines. The psychological weight of the hallowed steel is a physical sensation for those who walk the decks today, a feeling that the iron is still warm from the friction of the struggle. We saw the light filtering through the portholes, illuminating the spaces where the fighting lady was nearly lost to the fire and the salt and the dark and the cold. The fascination of the silence was the way it seemed to hold the echoes of the Laffey spirit, a rhythmic and steady and proud and glorious and absolute and final heartbeat of a ship. We felt the psychological weight of the permanence, a realization that as long as this hull existed, the truth of the 80 minutes would remain a solid and heavy and dark and cold and silent fact. The secret flaw of the logic was that the ship was just a machine, but the secret of the reality was that she was a living part of the men who defended her. The air in the engine room is heavy with the past, a scent of oil and old steam that bridges the gap between the then and the now and the forever. The fascination with the secret flaw of the Laffey's preservation is the psychological weight of the battle against the elements, a struggle that mirrors the fight against the Kamikazes on the picket station of the war. The secret flaw of the river was the mud that threatened to bury the hull in a silent and heavy and dark and cold, an absolute and final and heavy embrace. We saw the massive cofferdams being built, a mechanical and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody effort to keep the legend from the deep. The fascination of the engineering was the way the modern world used its best technology to save a relic of the ancient and heavy and dark and cold and violent and absolute Pacific. We felt the psychological weight of the victory when the hull was finally sealed, a second and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy resurrection for the ship that refused to die. The secret flaw of the neglect was a lesson in the importance of the memory, a reminder that the fire of the past must be tended by the hands of the living and the free. The air around the dry dock was electric with the sound of the work, a song of the iron that was being sung for the sake of the and heavy and dark. I remember the secret flaw of the final reunion, where the fascination was the sight of the last survivors looking at the Laffey, with eyes that had seen the very end of the and heavy and dark and cold. The psychological weight of the final roll call was a moment of silence that lasted for an eternity in the hearts of the old men who stood on the deck. We saw the names being read, each one a bell that rang through the rigging and out across the water of the harbor and the heavy and dark and silent Pacific. The fascination of the closure was the way the veterans touched the guns, their hands gnarled by time but still carrying the memory of the triggers and the heavy and dark and absolute and final fire. We felt the psychological weight of the passing, a realization that the story was now a flame that we had to carry forward into the and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep. The secret flaw of the mortality was the end of the flesh, but the secret of the immortality was the heart of the ship that would never stay buried in the fire. The air was filled with the scent of the flags and the sea, a final and absolute and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy salute to the brave. The fascination with the secret flaw of the Laffey's presence in the digital age is the psychological weight of her story reaching a world that has never known the taste of the salt or the fire. The secret flaw of the screen is the distance it creates, but the secret of the impact is the way the fighting lady still commands the attention of the and heavy and dark. We saw the videos and the documentaries spreading the legend of the 22 Kamikazes to millions of curious and modern and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily souls. The fascination of the connection was the realization that the story of the Laffey is a universal narrative of the small standing against the massive and the lethal and the absolute. We felt the psychological weight of the legacy, a feeling that our struggle was now a beacon for everyone who faces a storm they cannot escape in the dark. The secret flaw of the history was its isolation, but the secret of the future was the way the ship that would not die became a part of the global and absolute and final and heavy light. The air of the internet is a vast and noisy place, but the story of the Laffey is a quiet and steady and proud and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy pulse. I often think about the secret flaw of the ship's name being a shield, the fascination with how the Laffey DD-724 fulfilled the legacy of the DD-459 that died in the dark of the Solomons. The psychological weight of the unfinished business was a drive that fueled the second ship to survive the fire that had claimed the first in the middle of the great and bloody war. We saw the two ships as parts of a single soul, a continuum of the iron and the fire and the absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep. The fascination of the survival was the way the second Laffey absorbed the vengeance intended for the first, a miracle of the and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute. We felt the psychological weight of the honor, a feeling that we had closed the circle and brought the name home to the harbor of the free and the proud and the light. The secret flaw of the tragedy was the loss, but the secret of the triumph was the way the name remained on the list of the living, and the and heavy and dark. The air around the memorial is a bridge between the two ships, a sacred and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying space. The fascination with the secret flaw of the Laffey's final state is that she remains a study in the absolute limits of human endurance and the miracle of the and heavy and dark and cold and silent. The psychological weight of her history is a physical fact that remains unchanged by the passing of the years or the changing of the and heavy and dark and absolute and final world. We see the ship sitting in the sun of South Carolina, her silhouette a reminder that the ship that would not die is still on her station and still on her watch. The fascination of the endurance is the way she continues to inspire, a story of how 80 minutes of hell created a century of honor and the heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep. We felt the psychological weight of the conclusion, a realization that the story of the Laffey is a story that will never truly and completely and absolute end in the dark or the fire. The secret flaw of the iron was its mortality, but the secret of the soul was the heart of the men who stood their ground when the sky was falling and the sea was on fire. The air is still, A moment of transition where the ghost of the Laffey sails into the sunset of the heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody. As the epic and visceral story of the USS Laffey and the ship that would not die reaches its final and quiet and peaceful and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final end, please consider subscribing for more naval mysteries. We are dedicated to telling the stories of the ships that fought the impossible and the men who lived in the shadows of the most colossal and tragic and beautiful and heavy and dark naval triumphs and sacrifices. The fascination with the DD-724 is a tribute to the power of courage, resilience, and the incredible and silent price of being the ship that faced 22 suicide attackers and refused to sink in the middle of the fire. Comment below. Do you believe the Laffey's survival was a miracle of engineering or a testament to the iron will of the men on the line? Share this story of secrecy and sacrifice to help us keep the memory of the fighting lady alive for a new and curious and modern generation of history seekers. Your support allows us to explore the secret flaws of history and bring the heroic ghosts of the deep back into the light of the modern and busy and noisy and living and heavy and dark and cold and silent world.